While the world's great powers tore each other apart between 1939 and 1945, a very different kind of war was being fought quietly in the capitals of South America. A war of spies, propaganda, smuggled diamonds, and diplomatic double-dealing, fought not with tanks and battleships, but with trade agreements and back-channel negotiations. And at the center of it sat a cluster of countries still nursing the wounds of a brutal war they'd fought against each other only a few years earlier, the Chaco War. Paraguay and Bolivia had spent the early 1930s locked in one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern Latin American history, fighting over a barren, oil-rumored stretch of scrubland called the Gran Chaco. That war left both nations exhausted, indebted, and deeply suspicious of their neighbors. And when a much larger war broke out across the Atlantic just a few years later, those same wounds, along with decades of German immigration, military training relationships, and economic dependency, shaped a strange and often overlooked chapter of the Second World War, the elaborate, high-stakes game of neutrality played by Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina, and their neighbors. This isn't a story about battles. It's a story about a region that mostly managed to avoid fighting the war directly, while becoming one of its most contested diplomatic and economic battlegrounds. A region where Nazi Germany cultivated influence for years, where Axis spy networks operated with startling freedom, and where the United States waged a quiet campaign to pull an entire continent into its camp before it was too late.
To understand Latin America's strange relationship with the Second World War, you first have to understand the war that came before it, one most people outside South America have never heard of. Between 1932 and 1935, Bolivia and Paraguay fought the Chaco War, a brutal conflict over control of the Gran Chaco region, driven partly by genuine border disputes and partly by the mistaken belief, held by both governments and encouraged by foreign oil companies, that the region sat atop substantial oil reserves. It didn't, as it turned out, but by the time that became clear, the war had already killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers on both sides, a catastrophic toll for two of the poorest, least populous nations in the hemisphere. The war left deep scars. Bolivia, having lost the war and a substantial portion of the disputed territory, experienced significant domestic political upheaval in its aftermath, with the military's humiliation contributing to a wave of nationalist and reformist movements that would shape Bolivian politics for a generation. Paraguay, despite technically winning, was left economically devastated and politically unstable as well. And, crucially, both countries emerged from the war having received extensive military training, arms, and advisory support from foreign powers, support that, in several cases, came directly from Germany, whose military advisors had been active in Bolivia in the years before the Chaco War, most notably the German general Hans Kunt, who commanded Bolivian forces for a period of the conflict. This German military connection to the region didn't disappear after the Chaco War ended. It became one of the threads Nazi Germany would later try to pull on as it built influence across South America in the years leading up to the Second World War. By the late 1930s, Latin America had become a genuine, if often underappreciated, battleground of influence between the Axis powers and the United States, and understanding why requires looking at several overlapping factors. Germany had substantial trade relationships with several South American nations, particularly Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia, built up over decades and reinforced through the interwar period as Germany sought markets and raw materials beyond a Europe increasingly hostile to German trade under the terms of the Versailles Settlement. German, Italian, and Japanese immigrant communities were also substantial across the region. Argentina and Brazil in particular had large German-descended populations, some of whose members maintained cultural and, in some cases, ideological ties to the fatherland that Nazi propaganda efforts actively worked to cultivate through organizations, schools, and media targeted at these communities. Strategically, Latin America mattered enormously to the United States for reasons that went well beyond sentiment or hemispheric solidarity. Raw materials from the region, Bolivian tin and tungsten, Chilean nitrates, Venezuelan and other regional oil, were considered vital to American and Allied war production. The vast, largely unmonitored coastlines of South America offered potential havens for German U-boats and surface raiders operating in the South Atlantic, a genuine concern borne out by real incidents of German commerce raiders operating in South American waters and using regional ports, sometimes controversially, for repair, resupply, or the landing of survivors. And perhaps most alarmingly to American planners, there were persistent fears, some well-founded, some exaggerated, that Axis-sympathetic elements within various Latin American militaries and governments might provide bases, intelligence, or even direct support for Axis operations against the Panama Canal or the southern approaches to the United States itself. This combination of factors meant that from roughly 1938 onward, the United States pursued an increasingly active policy centered on what became known as the good neighbor diplomatic approach, along with substantial economic and military assistance programs aimed at binding Latin American nations more closely to the United States and countering German influence before it could translate into anything more dangerous. Bolivia occupied a particularly delicate position in this contest, for reasons rooted directly in its Chaco War experience and its economic dependence on a single, strategically vital resource: tin. Bolivian tin was considered critically important to Allied war production once Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia cut off the major tin-producing regions of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies in early 1942. Suddenly, Bolivia's tin mines, largely controlled by a small handful of powerful mining families, became one of the Allies' few remaining major sources of a metal essential to everything from ammunition casings to electronics. This gave the United States enormous leverage over Bolivian policy, since American purchases of Bolivian tin, negotiated at prices Bolivia's government considered exploitatively low, represented a huge share of the country's export economy. At the same time, Bolivia's military establishment retained meaningful sympathy toward Germany, a legacy of the pre-Chaco War German advisory relationship and reinforced by ongoing nationalist and, in some quarters, explicitly fascist sympathetic political currents that had gained strength amid the social upheaval following the Chaco War's humiliating outcome. This tension came to a head dramatically in December 1943, when a military coup led by Major Gualberto Villarroel and closely tied to a nationalist political movement with documented, if debated in extent, connections to Axis sympathizers, overthrew Bolivia's existing government. The Villarroel government's ties to Axis interests were serious enough that the United States, along with several other Latin American governments, initially refused to formally recognize the new administration, citing credible intelligence suggesting genuine Nazi German involvement in facilitating or encouraging the coup. Diplomatic recognition was eventually extended only after Bolivia agreed to declare war on the Axis powers in April 1944 and to take more concrete action against German influence within the country, including tightening controls on Bolivia's substantial German immigrant community and the various pro-Axis organizations that had operated with considerable freedom in the preceding years. Paraguay, Bolivia's old Chaco War adversary, took a notably different, quieter path through the war. one shaped by its own particular blend of post-war exhaustion, internal political instability, and a genuinely deep, if complicated, set of ties to European fascism. Paraguay, under President Higinio Marínigo, who had come to power via a coup in 1940, maintained a cautious, ambiguous position through most of the war's early years, one that Allied diplomats found frustratingly difficult to pin down. Marínigo's government contained figures with genuine sympathies toward fascist ideology, and Paraguay's substantial German immigrant community, along with organizations linked to it, operated with a degree of freedom that concerned American and British observers monitoring Axis influence across the region. Paraguay eventually broke diplomatic relations with the Axis powers in 1942 under considerable pressure from the United States, part of a broader wave of Latin American nations severing ties with Germany, Italy, and Japan in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor and the subsequent Rio Conference, where American diplomacy pushed hard for hemispheric solidarity against the Axis. But breaking diplomatic relations was a far cry from actively joining the war effort, and Paraguay, like several of its neighbors, maintained this halfway position, formally aligned against the Axis on paper, while contributing essentially nothing in practical military terms for most of the remaining war years, only formally declaring war on Germany in February 1945, a largely symbolic gesture made when the war's outcome was no longer remotely in doubt. No discussion of Latin American neutrality during the Second World War is complete without Argentina, whose position was, by a wide margin, the most stubborn, controversial, and consequential of any nation in the hemisphere. Argentina maintained formal neutrality for almost the entire duration of the war, becoming, alongside Chile for a time, one of the last major holdouts in a hemisphere that had otherwise, at least on paper, aligned firmly against the Axis. Argentina's reasons for this were complex and multi-layered. The country had deep economic and cultural ties to Britain, its largest historical trading partner, which complicated any simple narrative of pro-Axis sympathy. But it also had a powerful, historically influential military establishment with genuine admiration for German military organization and doctrine, a substantial German immigrant population, and a political establishment deeply resistant to what many Argentine nationalists viewed as excessive American pressure and hemispheric domination disguised as wartime solidarity. Argentine neutrality became a source of enormous frustration for the United States as the war progressed, particularly after a 1943 military coup brought to power a government with even more pronounced nationalist and, in the eyes of American officials, Axis-sympathetic tendencies. A government that would eventually see the rise of a young colonel named Juan Perón, whose later political career as Argentina's president would be shaped significantly by the networks, sympathies, and political currents that had flourished during these neutral wartime years. American frustration wasn't merely diplomatic posturing. There was substantial, well-documented evidence of active German intelligence operations running through Argentina throughout the war, including espionage networks gathering shipping information used to target Allied vessels in the South Atlantic, and financial and logistical channels that Argentina's government either tolerated or, according to some accounts, actively facilitated. Argentina's neutrality also made it both during and especially after the war a notably hospitable destination for fleeing Nazi war criminals seeking to escape prosecution, a grim legacy connected directly to the networks and sympathies cultivated during these neutral wartime years, and one that would haunt Argentina's international reputation for decades afterward. Under sustained and intense American diplomatic pressure, including economic measures and Argentina's exclusion from certain hemispheric agreements, and eventually threats regarding its status at the planned founding conference of the United Nations, Argentina finally broke relations with the Axis in early 1944 and formally declared war on Germany and Japan in March 1945, one of the very last nations in the world to do so, and only weeks before the war in Europe ended entirely. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most symbolic and least substantive war declarations of the entire conflict. Part 6. The Spy War Nobody Talks About. Behind the diplomatic maneuvering of governments, a genuine intelligence war was being fought across the region throughout the conflict, one that rarely gets the attention it deserves in popular accounts of WWII espionage that tend to focus almost exclusively on Europe. German intelligence services, primarily the Abwehr, maintained active networks across several South American countries, using them for a range of purposes, gathering and transmitting information on Allied shipping movements that could be used to direct U-boat attacks in the South Atlantic, and monitoring and attempting to influence local politics in directions favorable to Axis interests, and, in some documented cases, planning or supporting sabotage operations against Allied economic interests in the region, including attempts targeting shipping and industrial facilities tied to war production. The United States responded with its own substantial intelligence effort, run primarily through the FBI's Special Intelligence Service under J. Edgar Hoover, a lesser-known but genuinely significant wartime intelligence operation that worked to identify and disrupt Axis networks across Latin America, often working closely and applying considerable pressure on local governments to crack down on German intelligence activities, propaganda organizations, and financial networks operating within their borders. This effort achieved real successes, rolling up several significant German spy networks over the course of the war, though the scale and persistence of Axis intelligence activity across the region, particularly in Argentina, demonstrated the practical limits of even a sustained, well-resourced counterintelligence campaign in countries whose own governments were, at best, ambivalent partners. It's worth dwelling on just how much of this entire regional drama was, at its core, about economics rather than ideology, because for most of the governments involved, the calculation of neutrality, alignment, or eventual token declarations of war was shaped overwhelmingly by practical questions of trade, resources, and access to American markets and financing, rather than any deep ideological commitment to either side. The United States used a powerful combination of carrots and sticks to shape Latin American policy throughout the war. Lend-lease military assistance, favorable trade agreements, and access to American capital markets were offered to governments willing to align against the Axis, while nations resisting this pressure, most notably Argentina, faced economic isolation, exclusion from hemispheric agreements, and diplomatic pressure that could threaten their broader international standing. This carrot-and-stick approach proved remarkably effective across most of the region. By 1944, nearly every Latin American nation had at least formally aligned against the Axis, even if, as with Paraguay and Bolivia, that alignment often amounted to little more than a diplomatic formality with minimal practical military contribution. For countries still recovering from the Chaco War's devastating economic toll, these American economic incentives were often simply too significant to refuse, regardless of whatever ideological sympathies individual political or military figures might have harbored toward the Axis powers. Practical economic survival, in the end, generally trumped ideological alignment across most of the region, a pattern that stands in notable contrast to the more ideologically committed alignments that characterized many of the war's European and Asian belligerents. Part 7.5. The Battleship That Tested Neutrality. If one single incident captures just how directly the war could intrude on this supposedly quiet, neutral region, it's the saga of the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, which brought actual naval combat to South American waters within the war's opening months, well before most of the diplomatic maneuvering described above had even really begun. In December 1939, the Graf Spee, which had been operating as a commerce raider sinking Allied merchant shipping across the South Atlantic, was intercepted and damaged by a squadron of British cruisers in the Battle of the River Plate, fought just off the coast of Uruguay and Argentina. The badly damaged German ship took refuge in the neutral port of Montevideo, Uruguay, triggering an immediate and intense diplomatic crisis that put South American neutrality rules to a genuine, high-stakes test just months into the war. International law governing neutral ports placed strict limits on how long a belligerent warship could remain for repairs before either departing or being interned for the war's duration, and Uruguay's government found itself under enormous pressure from both British diplomats eager to see the ship forced back out to sea where waiting Royal Navy vessels could finish the job, and German diplomats desperately seeking more time for repairs. Uruguay ultimately granted only a limited extension, insufficient for full repairs, forcing German captain Hans Langsdorff into an agonizing decision. Rather than risk his crew in what he believed was a hopeless battle against a much larger waiting British force, a belief later shown to be based on inflated British deception about the size of the waiting fleet, Langsdorff made the extraordinary decision to scuttle his own ship in the River Plate estuary on December 17, 1939, in full view of thousands of spectators who had gathered on the Montevideo waterfront to watch history unfold. Langsdorff took his own life days later. The episode was an early, dramatic demonstration of exactly the kind of pressure neutral South American nations would repeatedly face throughout the war, caught between competing belligerent demands, international legal obligations around neutrality, and their own domestic political considerations, all while trying to avoid becoming an actual battlefield themselves. Uruguay's relatively firm handling of the Graf Spee affair, in contrast to the more ambiguous positions some neighboring governments would later adopt, earned it a reputation among Allied diplomats as one of the more reliably cooperative neutral nations in the region throughout the years that followed. Argentina wasn't entirely alone in its prolonged neutrality, even if it became by far the most notorious and diplomatically contentious case. Chile also maintained formal neutrality for much of the war, a position shaped by its own significant German immigrant population, a military tradition with historical Prussian influences dating back to earlier German military missions that had helped modernize the Chilean armed forces decades before the war, and a degree of economic dependency on trade relationships that made Chilean policymakers similarly cautious about moving too quickly against Axis interests. Chile broke diplomatic relations with the Axis powers in January 1943, considerably later than most of its neighbors, and well after the momentum of hemispheric solidarity had already swept most of Latin America into at least nominal alignment against Germany, Italy, and Japan. Even after breaking relations, Chile, like Paraguay and several other nations discussed above, did not formally declare war until very late in the conflict, doing so only in February 1945 alongside a wave of other last-minute declarations, made largely to secure a nation's position for participation in the post-war international order then being negotiated, rather than out of any genuine wartime military contribution. This pattern, formal neutrality maintained for years, followed by a break in relations under sustained American pressure, followed eventually by a largely symbolic late-war declaration of war timed more around post-war diplomatic considerations than any actual military necessity, repeated itself with remarkable consistency across multiple Latin American nations, revealing just how much of the region's wartime alignment was fundamentally a performance staged for an audience of great powers, rather than a reflection of genuine belligerent commitment. Only Brazil, among the major South American nations, actually committed substantial combat forces to the war effort, sending an expeditionary force to fight alongside Allied troops in the Italian campaign. A notable exception that stands in sharp contrast to the far more cautious, transactional approach adopted by Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Chile throughout the conflict's duration. Part 8. Why this story matters. The story of Latin American neutrality during the Second World War rarely makes it into popular accounts of the conflict. And it's worth thinking about why, because the reasons say something important about how wartime history gets remembered and told. Partly, it's simply a story without dramatic battles. There were no major military campaigns fought across South American soil, no iconic images of tanks or beach landings to anchor popular memory the way Normandy or Iwo Jima do. Partly, it's a story that complicates the comfortable narrative of a unified hemisphere standing firmly against fascism, revealing instead a much messier picture of self-interested governments, genuine Axis sympathy in several influential quarters, and alignment driven as much by economic pressure as by ideological conviction. And partly, the story's uncomfortable post-war legacy, Argentina's role as a haven for fleeing Nazi war criminals chief among them, made it a subject some governments in the region have historically been less than eager to revisit in detail. But this quiet, unglamorous diplomatic and economic struggle mattered enormously to the actual outcome of the war. Bolivian 10 helped keep Allied war production running after Japan cut off the major Asian supply. The eventual, if often reluctant, alignment of the entire hemisphere against the Axis denied Germany potential havens, resources, and intelligence-gathering opportunities that could have meaningfully extended the South Atlantic Naval War. And the whole episode offers a valuable reminder that the Second World War wasn't simply a contest of armies and navies. It was also a global contest for resources, influence, and allegiance, fought in council chambers and trade negotiations as much as on any battlefield, in places the standard telling of the war rarely thinks to look. The countries that had spent the early 1930s bleeding each other dry over a worthless stretch of Chaco scrubland spent the early 1940s navigating an entirely different kind of conflict, one fought with tin contracts and diplomatic notes instead of rifles, but one whose outcome mattered just as much to the war's ultimate course as any battle fought on a more famous front. There's a final sobering thread worth pulling on before closing out this story, because the region's wartime ambiguity didn't simply end when the guns fell silent in 1945. The networks of sympathy, financial channels, and safe contacts that had allowed Axis influence to flourish across parts of South America throughout the war years became, in the war's immediate aftermath, exactly the infrastructure that facilitated one of the war's more troubling post-war episodes: the flight of numerous high-ranking Nazi officials and war criminals to South America, with Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia being the most common destinations. Figures like Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, lived for years in Argentina under a false identity before being tracked down and captured by Israeli intelligence agents in 1960. Josef Mengele, the notorious Auschwitz physician responsible for horrific medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, spent years moving between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, evading capture until his death in Brazil in 1979. Klaus Barbie, the wartime Gestapo chief in Lyon, known for brutal interrogations of French resistance members, found refuge in Bolivia, where he later became entangled in that country's turbulent post-war politics before eventually being extradited to France decades later. This grim postscript underscores just how consequential the region's wartime ambiguity actually was, extending its impact for decades beyond 1945 itself. The same Chaco-scarred nations that had spent the war years carefully hedging between economic pragmatism and quiet sympathy to a losing cause became in peacetime unwitting hosts to some of the era's most notorious perpetrators, a legacy that Latin American nations and the broader world would spend the following half-century reckoning with, long after the war itself had faded from living memory everywhere else.